Section 34 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by TechSavvy. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. Exploration of the World by Jules Verne. Second Part, Chapter 3. Part 1a. The Polar Expeditions and the Search for the Northwest Passage. Part 1a. The Northmen. Pytheas had opened up the road to the north to the Scandinavians by discovering Iceland, the famous Thule, and the Cronian Ocean, of which the mud, the shallow water, and the ice render the navigation dangerous, and where the nights are as light as twilight. The traditions of the voyages undertaken by the ancients to the Orkneys, the Faroe Islands, and even to Iceland, were treasured up among Irish monks, who were learned men, and themselves bold mariners, as their successive establishments in these archipelagos clearly prove. They were also the pilots of the Northmen, a name given generally to the Scandinavian pirates, both Danish and Norwegian, who rendered themselves so formidable to the whole of Europe during the Middle Ages. But if all the information that we owe to the ancients, both Greeks and Romans, with regard to this Hyperborean countries, be extremely vague, and so to speak fabulous, it is not so with that which concerns the adventurous enterprises of the men of the North. The sagas, as the Icelandic and the Danish songs are called, are extremely precise, and the numerous data which we owe to them are daily confirmed by the archaeological discoveries made in America, Greenland, Iceland, Norway, and Denmark. This is a source of valuable information which was long unknown and unexplored, and of which we owe the revelation to the learned Dane, C.C. Raffin, who was furnished us with the authentic facts of the greatest interest, bearing on the pre-Columbian discovery of America. Norway was poor and encumbered with population. Hence arose the necessity for a permanent emigration, which should allow a considerable portion of the inhabitants to seek in more favored regions of the nourishment which a frozen soil denied them. When they had found some country rich enough to yield them an abundant spoil, they then returned to their own land, and set out the following spring, accompanied by all those who could be enticed either by the love of lucre, the desire of an easy life, or by the thirst of strife. Intrepid hunters and fishermen, accustomed to a dangerous navigation between the continent and the mass of islands which border it, and appeared to defend it against the assaults of the ocean, and across the narrow, deep fjords, which seem as though they were cut into soil itself by some gigantic sword. They set out in those oak vessels, the sight of which made the people tremble who lived on the shores of the North Sea and the British Channel. Sometimes decked, these vessels, long or short, large or small, were usually terminated in front by a spur of enormous size, above which the prow sometimes rose to a great height, taking the form of an S. The whole Rieslinger, for so they call the graphic representations so often met on the rocks of Sweden and Norway, enable us to picture to ourselves these swift vessels which could carry a considerable crew. Such was the Long Serpent of Olaf Tryggvason, which had 32 benches of rowers and held 90 men; Canute's vessel, which carried 60; and the 2 vessels of Olaf and Saint, which carried sometimes 200 men. The sea kings, as they often call these adventurers, lived on the ocean, never settling on shore, passing from the pillage of a castle to the burning of an abbey, devastating the coasts of France, ascending rivers, especially the Seine, as far as Paris, sailing over the Mediterranean as far as Constantinople, establishing themselves later in Sicily, and leaving traces of their incursions or their sojourn in all the regions of the known world. Piracy, far from being, as at the present day, an act falling under the ban of the law, was not only encouraged in that barbarous or half civilized society, but was celebrated in the songs of skalds, who reserve their most enthusiastic eulogies for celebrating chivalrous struggles, adventurous privateering, and all the exhibitions of strength. From the 8th century these formidable sea rovers frequented the groups of the Orkney, the Hebrides, the Shetland, and the Faroe Islands, where they met with the Irish monks who had settled themselves there nearly a century earlier, to instruct the idolatrous population. In 861 a Norwegian pirate named Nadod was carried by a storm towards an island covered with snow, which he named Snowland, Land of Snow, a name changed later to that of Iceland, Land of Ice. There again the Northmen found the Irish monks under the name of Papists, in the cantons of Papaya and Papilai. Ingolf installed himself some years afterwards in the country, and founded Reykjavik. In 1885 the triumph of Harold Harfager, who had just subjugated the whole of Norway by force of arms, brought a considerable number of malcontents to Iceland. They established there the republican form of government, which had just been overthrown in their own country, and which subsisted till 1261, the epoch when Iceland passed under the dominion of the kings of Norway. When established in Iceland, these bold fellows, lovers of adventure and of long hunts in pursuit of seals and walrus, retained their wandering habits and pursued their bold plans in the west, where only 3 years after the arrival of Ingolf, Gumbjorn discovered the snowy peaks of the mountains of Greenland. 5 years later, Eric the Red, banished from Iceland for murder, rediscovered the land in latitude 64 degrees north, of which Gumbjorn had caught a glimpse. The sterility of this ice-bound coast made him decide to seek a milder climate with a more open country and one producing more game in the south. So he rounded Cape Farewell at the extremity of Greenland, established himself on the west coast, and built himself vast dwellings for himself and his companions, of which M. Jorgensen has discovered the ruins. This country was worthy at that period of the name of Greenland which the Northmen gave to it, but the annual and great increase of the glaciers has rendered it since that epoch a land of desolation. Eric returned to Iceland to seek his friends, and in the same year that he returned to Brattahalida, for so he called his settlement, 14 vessels laden with emigrants came to join him. It was a veritable exodus. These events took place in the year 1000. As quickly as the resources of the country allowed of it, the population of Greenland increased, and in 1121 Gardar, the capital of the country, became the seat of Bizobrick, which existed until after the discovery of Antilles by Christopher Columbus. In 986, John Heriulfsson, who had come from Norway to Iceland to spend the winter with his father, learnt that the latter had joined Eric the Red in Greenland. Without hesitation the young man again put to sea, seeking at haphazard for a country of which he did not even know the exact situation, and was cast by currents on coasts which we think must have been those of New Scotland, Newfoundland, and Maine. He ended, however, by reaching Greenland, where Eric, the powerful Norwegian Jarl, reproached him for not having examined with more care countries of which he owed his knowledge to a happy accident of sea. Eric had sent his son Leif to the Norwegian court, so close at this time was the connection between the metropolis and the colonies. The king, who had been converted to Christianity, had just dispatched a mission to Iceland charged to overthrow the worship of Odin. He committed to Leif's care some priests who were to instruct the Greenlanders, but scarcely had the young adventurer returned to his own country, when he left the holy men to work out the accomplishment of their difficult task, and the hearing of the discovery made by Bjorn, he fitted out his vessels and went to seek for the lands which had been only imperfectly seen. He landed first on a desolate and stony plain, to which he gave the name of Hallulen, of which we have no hesitation in recognizing as Newfoundland. and afterwards on a flat sandy shore, behind which rose an immense screen of dark forests, cheered by the songs of innumerable birds. A third time he put to sea, and steering towards the south he arrived at the Bay of Rhode Island, where the mild climate and the river teeming with salmon induced him to settle, and where he constructed vast buildings of planks, which he called Leifsbude, Life's house. Then he sent some of his companions to explore the country, and they returned with the good news that the wild vine grows in the country to which it owes the name of Vinland. In the spring of the year 1001, Leif, having laded his ship with skins, grapes, wood, and other productions of the country, set out for Greenland. He had made the valuable observation that the shortest day in Vinland lasted 9 hours, which places the site of Leifsbude at 41 degrees 24 minutes 10 seconds. This fortunate voyage and the salvage of a Norwegian vessel carrying 15 men gained for Leif the surname of the Fortunate. This expedition made a great stir, and the account of the wonders of the country in which Leif had settled induced his brother Thorvald to set out with 30 men. After passing the winter at Leifsbude, Thorvald explored the coasts to the south, returning in the autumn to Vinland, and in the following year 1004 he sailed along the coast to the north of Leifsbude. During this return voyage the Northmen met the Esquimaux for the first time, and without any provocation slaughtered them without mercy. The following night they found themselves all at once surrounded by a numerous flotilla of kayaks, from which came a cloud of arrows. Thorvald alone, the chief of the expedition, was mortally wounded. He was buried by the companions on a promontory to which they gave the name of the Promontory of the Cross. Now, in the Gulf of Boston, in the 18th century, a tomb of masonry was discovered, in which, with the bones, was found a sword hilt of iron. The Indians not being acquainted with this metal, it could not be one of their skeletons. It was not either the remains of one of the Europeans who had landed after the 15th century, for their swords had not this very characteristic form. This tomb has been thought to be that of the Scandinavian, and we venture to say that of Thorvald, son of Eric the Red. In the spring of 1007, 3 vessels carrying 160 men and some cattle left Eriksfjord. The object in view was the foundation of a permanent colony. The emigrants, after sighting Helluland, Markland, and Vinland, landed in an island, upon which they constructed some barracks and began the work of cultivation. But they must either have laid their plans badly, or have been wanting in foresight, for the winter found them without provisions, and they suffered cruelly from hunger. They had, however, the good sense to regain the continent, where in comparative ease they could await the end of the winter. At the beginning of 1008 they set out to seek for Leifsbude, and settled themselves at the Mount Hope Bay, on opposite shore to the old settlement of Leif. There, for the first time, some intercourse was held with the natives, called Skrellings in the sagas, and whom, from the manner in which they are portrayed, it is easy to recognize as Esquimaux. The first meeting was peaceable, and the barter was carried on with them until the day when the desire of Esquimaux to acquire iron hatchets, always prudently refused them by the Northmen, drove them to acts of aggression, which decided the newcomers, after 3 years of residence, to return to their own country, which they did without leaving behind any lasting trace of their stay in the country. It will be easily understood that we cannot give any detailed account of all the expeditions which set out from Greenland and succeeded each other on the coasts of Labrador and the United States. Those of our readers who wish for circumstantial details should refer to M. Gabriel Gravier's interesting publication, the most complete work on the subject, and from which we have borrowed all that relates to the Norman expeditions. The same year as Eric the Red landed in Greenland (983), a certain Harry Marson, being driven out of the ordinary course by storms, was cast upon the shores of a country known by the name of White Man's Land, which extended, according to Rafn, from Chesapeake Bay to Florida. What is the meaning of this name, White Man's Land? Had some compatriots of Marson's already settled there? There is some reason to suppose so even from the words used in the chronicle. We can understand how interesting it would be to be able to determine the nationality of these first colonists. However, the sagas have not as yet revealed all their secrets. There are probably some of them still unknown, and as those which have been successively discovered have confirmed facts already admitted, there is every reason to hope that our knowledge of Icelandic navigation may become more precise. Another legend, of which great part is mere romance, but which nevertheless contains a foundation of truth, relates that a certain John, obliged to quit Iceland in consequence of an unfortunate passion, took refuge in the countries beyond Vinland, where in 1027 he was found by some of his countrymen. In 1051, during another expedition, an Icelandic woman was killed by some Skrellings, and in 1867 a tomb was exhumed bearing a runic inscription and containing bones and some articles of the toilet, which are now preserved in the museum at Washington. This discovery was made at the exact spot indicated in the saga which relates these events, and which was not itself discovered until 1863. But the Northmen established in Iceland and Greenland were not the only people who frequented the coast of America about the year 1000, which is proved by the name of the Great Ireland, which was given to the White Man's Land. As the history of Madoc op Owen proves, that Irish and the Welsh founded colonies there, regarding which we have but little information, but vague and uncertain as it is. M.D. Avzack and Gaffarel agree in recognizing its probability. Having now said a few words upon the travels and the settlements of the Northmen in Labrador, Vinland, and the more southern countries, we must return to the north. The colonies first founded in the neighborhood of Cape Farewell had not been slow in stretching along the western coast, which at this period was infinitely less desolate than it is at the present day, as far as the northern latitudes, which were not again reached until our own day. Thus at this time they caught seals, walrus, and whales in the Bay of Disco. There were 190 towns counted then in Westerbygd, and 86 in Esterbyd, while at the present day there are far fewer Danish settlements on these icy shores. These towns were probably only inconsiderable groups of those houses in stone and wood, of which so many ruins have been found from Cape Farewell as far as Upernavik in about 72 degrees 50'. At the same time, numerous runic inscriptions which have now been deciphered have given a degree of absolute certainty to facts so long unknown. But how many of these vestiges of the past still remain to be discovered? How many of these valuable evidences of the bravery and the spirit of enterprise of the Scandinavian race are forever buried under the glaciers? We have also obtained evidence that Christianity had been brought into America, and especially into Greenland. To this country, according to the instructions of Pope Gregory IV, there were pastoral visits made to strengthen the newly converted Northmen in the faith, and to evangelize the Esquimaux and the Indian tribes. Besides this, M. Ryant in 1865 has proved incontrovertibly that the Crusades were preached in Greenland in the bishopric of Gardar, as well as in the islands and the neighboring lands, and that up to 1418 Greenland paid to the Holy See tithes and St. Peter's pence, which for that year consisted of 2600 pounds of walrus tusks. The Norwegian colonies owe their downfall and ruin to various causes. To the very rapid extension of the glaciers. Hayes has proved that the glacier of Friar John moves at the rate of about 33 yards annually. To the bad policy of the mother country, which prevented the recruiting of the colonies. to the Black Plague, which decimated the population of Greenland from 1347 to 1351. Lastly, to the depredations of the pirates who ravaged this already enfeebled countries in 1418, and in whom some have thought they recognized certain inhabitants of the Orkney and the Faroe Islands, of which we are now about to speak. One of the companions of William the Conqueror, named St. Clair or Sinclair, not thinking that the portion of the conquered country allotted to him was proportioned to in his merits, went to try his luck in Scotland, where he was not long in rising to fortune and honours. In the latter half of the 14th century the Orkney Islands passed into the hands of his descendants. About 1390, a certain Niccolo Zeno, a member of one of the most ancient and noble Venetian families, who had fitted out a vessel at his own expense to visit England and Flanders as a matter of curiosity, was wrecked in the archipelago of the Orkneys, whither he had been driven by a storm. He was about to be massacred by the inhabitants when the Earl Henry Sinclair took him under his protection. The history of this wreck and the adventures and the discoveries which followed it, published in the collection of Ramusio, had been written by Antonio Zeno, says Clement Sparkum, the learned geographer, in his Threshold of the Unknown Region. Unfortunately, one of his descendants, named Niccolo Zeno, born in 1515, when a boy, not knowing the value of these papers, tore them up, but some of the letters surviving, he was able from them subsequently to compile the narrative as we now have it, and which was printed in Venice in 1558. There was also found in the palace an old map, rotten with age, illustrative of his voyages. Of this he made a copy, unluckily supplying from his own reading of the narrative what he thought was a requisite for its illustration. By doing this in a blundering way, unaided by the geographical knowledge which enables us to see where he goes astray, he threw the whole of the geography which he derived from the narrative into the most lamentable confusion, while those parts of the map which are not thus sophisticated, and which are consequently original, present an accuracy far in advance by many generations of the geography even of Niccolo Zeno's time, and confirm in a notable manner the site of the old Greenland colony. In these facts we have not only the solution of all the discussions which have arisen on the subject, but the most indisputable proof of the authenticity of the narrative. For it is clear that Niccolo Zeno the junior could not himself have been the ingenious concocter of a story, the straightforward truth of which he could thus ignorantly distort upon the face of the map. The name of Zichy, in which writers of the present day, and the chief among them Mr. H. Major, who was rescued these facts from the domain of fable, recognize the name of Sinclair, appears to be in fact only applicable to his Earl of Orkneys. At this time the seas of the north of Europe were infected by Scandinavian pirates. Sinclair, who had recognized in Zeno a clever mariner, attached him to himself, and with him conquered the country of Frisland, the haunt of pirates, who ravaged all the north of Scotland. In the maps at the end of the 15th and the beginning of the 16th century, this name is applied to the archipelago of the Faroe Islands. A reasonable indication, for Buache has recognized in the present names of the harbours and the islands of the archipelago a considerable number of those given by Zeno. Finally, the facts which we owe to the Venetian navigator about the waters, abounding in fish and dangerous from shallows, which divide this archipelago, are still true at the present day. Satisfied with his position, Zeno wrote to his brother Antonio to come and join him. While Sinclair was conquering the Faroe Islands, the Norwegian pirates desolated the Shetland Islands, then called Eastland. Niccolo set sail to give them battle, but was himself obliged to fly before their fleet, much more numerous than his own, and to take refuge on a small island on the coast of Iceland. After wintering in this place, Zeno must have landed the following year in the eastern coast of Greenland, at 69 degrees north latitude, in a place where was a monastery of the order of Preaching Friars, and a church dedicated to St. Thomas. The cells were warmed by a natural spring of hot water, which the monks used to prepare their food and bake their bread. The monks had also gardens covered over in the winter season and warmed by the same means, so that they were able to produce flowers, fruits, and herbs, as well as if they lived in a mild climate. There would seem to be some confirmation of these narratives in the fact that between the years 1828 to 1830 a captain of the Danish navy met with a population of 600 individuals at 69 degrees north latitude of a purely European type. But these adventurers' travels in countries of which the climate was so different from that of Venice proved fatal to Zeno, who died a short time after his return to Frisland. An old sailor who had returned with the Venetian, and who said had been for many long years a prisoner in the countries of the extreme west, gave to Sinclair such precise and tempting details of the fertility and the extent of these regions, that the latter resolved to attempt their conquest with Antonio Zeno, who had rejoined his brother, but the inhabitants showed themselves everywhere so hostile, and opposed such resistance to the strangers' landing, that Sinclair, after a long and dangerous voyage, was obliged to return to Frisland. These are all the details that have been left to us, and they make us deeply regret the loss of those that Antonio should have furnished in his letters to the Father Carlo on the subject of the countries which Forster and Malto Brun have thought may be identified with Newfoundland. Who knows if in his voyage to England, and during his wanderings as far as Thule, Christopher Columbus may not have heard mentioned the ancient expeditions of the Northmen and the Zeni, and if this information may not have appeared to him a strange confirmation of the theories of which he held, and of the ideas of whose realization he came to claim the protection of the King of England. From the collection of facts which have been there briefly given, it follows that America was known to Europeans and had been colonized before the time of Columbus, but in consequence of various circumstances, and foremost among these must be placed the rarity of communication between the people in the north of Europe and those in the south, the discoveries made by the Northmen were only vaguely known in Spain and Portugal. Judging by the appearance, we of the present day know much more on this subject than did the fellow countrymen and the contemporaries of Columbus. If the Genoese mariner had been informed of the existence of some rumors, he classed them with this information he had collected in the Cape de Verde Islands, and his classical recollections of the famous island of Antilia and the Atlantides of Plato. From this information, which came from so many different sides, the certainty awoke with him that the East should be reached by the western route. However it may be, his glory remains whole and entire. He is really the discoverer of America, and not those who were carried thither in spite of themselves by chances of wind and storm, and without their having any intention of reaching the shores of Asia, which Christopher Columbus would have done, had not the way been barred by America. The information that we are about to give on the family of Cortereal, although it may be much more complete than which can be met with in biographical dictionaries, is still extremely vague. Nevertheless, we must content ourselves with it, for up to this time history has not collected further details concerning this race of intrepid navigators. Jules Cortereal was the natural son of a gentleman named Vasco da Costa, who had received the sobriquet of Cortereal from the King of Portugal, on account of the magnificence of his house and followers. Devoted, like so many other gentlemen of this period, to seafaring adventure, Jules had carried off in Galicia a young girl named Maria de Abarca, who became his wife. After having been gentleman usher to the Infante Don Fernando, he was sent by the king of the North Atlantic with Alvaro Martins Oman. The two navigators saw an island known from this time by the name of Terra do Bacalhaos, the land of codfish, which must really have been Newfoundland. The date of this discovery is approximately fixed by the fact that on their return they landed at Terceira, and finding the captainship vacant by the death of Jacome de Bruges, they went to ask for it from the Infanta Dona Bredes, the widow of the Infante Don Fernando. She bestowed it upon them on condition that they would divide it between them, a fact which is confirmed by a deed of gift dated from Evora, the 2nd of April, 1464. Though one cannot guarantee the authenticity of this discovery of America, it is nevertheless an ascertained fact that Cortereal's voyage must have been signalized by some extraordinary event. Donations of such importance as this were only made to those who had rendered some great service to the crown. When Jules Cortereal was settled at Terceira from 1490 to 1497, he caused a fine palace to be built in the town of Angra, where he lived with his 3 children. His third son, Gaspard, after having been in the service of King Emmanuel, when the latter was only Duke de Bourges, had felt himself attracted while still young to the enterprises of discovery which had rendered his father illustrious. By an act dated from Sintra, the 12th of March, 1500, King Emmanuel made a gift to Gaspard Cortereal of any islands or terra firma which he might discover, and the king added this valuable information, that already and at other times he had sought for them on his own account and at his own expense. For Gaspard Cortereal this was not his first essay. Probably his researches may have been directed to the parts where his father had discovered the island of Cod. At his own expense, although with the assistance of the king, Gaspard Cortereal fitted out 2 vessels at the commencement of the summer of 1500, and after having touched at Terceira, he sailed towards the northwest. His first discovery was of a land of which the fertile and the verdant aspect seems to have charmed him. This was Canada. He saw there a great river bearing ice along with it on its course, the St. Lawrence, which some of his companions mistook for an arm of the sea, and to which he gave the name of Rio Navarro. Its volume is so considerable that it is not probable that this country is an island. Besides, it must be completely covered with a very thick coating of snow to produce such a stream of water. The houses in this country were of wood and covered with skins and furs. The inhabitants were unacquainted with iron, but used swords made of sharpened stones, and their arrows were tipped with fish bones or stones. Tall and well made, their faces and bodies were painted in different colors according to taste. They wore golden and copper bracelets, and dressed themselves in garments of fur. Cortereal pursued his voyage and arrived at the Cape of Bacalaos. Fishes, which were found in such great quantities upon this coast that they hindered the advance of the caravels. Then he followed the shore for a stretch of 600 miles, from 56 degrees to 60 degrees, or even more, naming the islands, the rivers, and the gulfs that he met with, as is proved by Terra do Labrador, Bahia de Conceição, and the landing and holding intercourse with the natives. Severe cold and a veritable river of gigantic blocks of ice prevented the expedition from going farther north, and it returned to Portugal, bringing back with it 57 natives. The very year of his return, on the 15th of May, 1501, Gaspard Cortereal, in pursuance of an order of the 15th of April, received provisions, and left Lisbon in the hope of extending the field of his discoveries. From this time he is never again mentioned. Michael Cortereal, his brother, who was the first gentleman usher to the king, then requested and obtained permission to go and seek his brother, and to pursue his enterprise. By an act of the 15th of January, 1502, a deed of gift conveyed to him the half of the terra firma and the islands which his brother might have discovered. Setting out on the 10th of May of this year with 3 vessels, Michael Cortereal reached Newfoundland, where he divided his little squadron, so that each of the vessels might explore the coast separately, while he fixed the place of rendezvous. But at the time fixed he did not reappear, and the 2 other vessels, after waiting for him till the 20th of August, set out on their return to Portugal. In 1503 the king sent 2 caravels to try to obtain news of the 2 brothers, but the search was in vain, and they returned without having acquired any information. When Vasco Annes, the last of the brothers Cortereal, who was captain and the governor of the islands of St. George and Terceira, and alcalde more of the town of Tavilla, became acquainted with these sad events, he resolved to fit out a vessel at his own cost, and to go and search for his brothers. The king, however, would not allow him to go, fearing to lose the last of this race of good servants. Upon the maps of this period, Canada is often indicated by the name of Terra de Cortereals, a name which is sometimes extended much further south, embracing a great part of North America. End of second part. Chapter 3. Part 1a.
Section 35 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. Exploration of the World, by Jules Verne. Second Part, Chapter 3, Part 1b. All that concerns John and Sebastian Cabot has been, until recently, shrouded by a mist, which is not even now completely dissipated, notwithstanding the conscientious labors of Biddle the American in 1831, and of our compatriot M. d'Avezac, as also those of Mr. Nichols the Englishman, who, taking advantage of the discoveries made among the English, Spanish, and Venetian archives, has built up an imposing monument, of which some parts, however, are open to discussion. It is from the last two named works that we shall draw the materials for this rapid sketch, but principally from Mr. Nichols' book, which has this advantage over the smaller volume of M. d'Avezac, that it relates the whole life of Sebastian Cabot. It has been found impossible to determine with certainty either the name or the nationality of John Cabot, and still less to settle the period of his birth. John Cabota, Coboto, or Cabot, must have been born, if not in Genoa itself, as M. d'Avezac asserts, at least in the neighborhood of that town, possibly at Castiglione, about the first quarter of the 15th century. Some historians have considered that he was an Englishman, and perhaps Mr. Nichols from national considerations is inclined to adopt this opinion. At least this seems to be the meaning of the expressions used by him. What we do know without room for doubt is that John Cabot came to London to occupy himself with commerce, and that he soon settled at Bristol, then the second town in the kingdom, in one of the suburbs which had received the name of Cathay, probably from the number of Venetians who resided there, and the trade carried on by them with the countries of the extreme East. It was at Bristol that Cabot's two youngest children were born, Sebastian and Sancho, if we may rely upon the following account given by the old chronicler Eden. Sebastian Cabot told me that he was born at Bristol, and that at 4 years of age he went with his father to Venice, returning with him to England some years later. This made people imagine that he was born in Venice. In 1476 John Cabot was at Venice, and there, on the 29th of March, he received letters of naturalization, which proved that he was not a native of this city, and that he must have merited the honor by some service rendered to the Republic. M. d'Avezac is inclined to think that he devoted himself to the study of cosmography and navigation, perhaps even in company with the celebrated Florentine, Paul Toscanelli, with whose theories upon the distribution of land and sea on the surface of the globe he would certainly be acquainted at this time. He may also have heard mention made of the island situated in the Atlantic, and known by the names of Antilla, the land of the Seven Cities, or Brazil. What seems more certain is, that his business affairs took him to the Levant, and, it is said, to Mecca, and that while there he would learn from what country came the spices, which then constituted the most important branch of Venetian commerce. Whatever value we may attach to these speculative theories, it is at least certain that John Cabot founded an important mercantile house at Bristol. His son Sebastian, who in these first voyages had acquired an inclination for the sea, studied navigation, as far as it was then known, and made some excursions on the sea, to render himself as familiar with the practice of this art as he already was with its theory. "For 7 years past," says the Spanish ambassador in a despatch of the 25th of July, 1498, speaking of an expedition commanded by Cabot, "the people of Bristol had fitted out 2, 3, or 4 caravels every year, to go in search of the island of Brazil, and of the Seven Cities, according to the ideas of the Genoese." At this time the whole of Europe resounded with the fame of the discoveries of Columbus. "It awoke in me," says Sebastian Cabot, in a narrative preserved by Ramusio, a great desire and a kind of ardour in my heart to do myself also something famous, and knowing by examining the globe that if I sailed by the west wind I should reach India more rapidly, I at once made my project known to his Majesty, who was much satisfied with it. The king to whom Cabot addressed himself was the same Henry VII., who, some years before, had refused all support to Christopher Columbus. It is evident that he received with favour the project which John and Sebastian Cabot had just submitted to him; and though Sebastian, in the fragment which we have just quoted, attributes to himself alone all the honour of the project, it is no less true that his father was the promoter of the enterprise, as the following charter shows, which we translate in an abridged form: "We, Henry, preserve our much beloved Jehan Cabot, citizen of Venice, and Louis, Sebastian, and Sancho, his sons, under our flag, and with 5 vessels of the tonnage and crew which they shall judge suitable to discover at their own expense and charge. We grant to them as well as to their heirs and assigns license to occupy, possess, at the charge of, by them, upon the profits, benefits, and advantages accruing from this navigation, to pay us in merchandise or in money the 5th part of the profit thus obtained for each of their voyages every time that they shall return to the port of Bristol, at which port they shall be compelled to land. We promise and guarantee to them, their heirs and assigns, that they shall be exempt from all custom house duties on the merchandise which they shall bring from the countries thus discovered. We command and direct all our subjects, as well on land as on the sea, to render assistance to the same Jehan and to his sons. Given at the 5th day of March, 1495. Such was the charter that was granted to John Cabot and his sons upon their return from the American continent, and not, as certain authors have pretended, anterior to this voyage. From the time that the news of the discovery made by Columbus had reached England, that is to say, probably in 1493, John and Sebastian Cabot prepared the expedition at their own expense, and set out at the beginning of the year 1494 with the idea of reaching Cathay, and finally the Indies. There can be no doubt upon this point, for in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris is preserved a unique copy of the map engraved in 1544, that is to say, in the lifetime of Sebastian Cabot, which mentions this voyage, and the precise and exact date of the discovery of Cape Breton. It is probable that we must attribute to the intrigues of the Spanish ambassador the delay which occurred in Cabot's expedition, for the whole of the year 1496 passed without the voyage being accomplished. The following year he set out at the beginning of summer. After having again sighted the Terra Buena Vista, he followed the coast, and was not long in perceiving to his great disappointment that it trended towards the north. Then, sailing along it to make sure if I could not find some passage, I could not perceive any, and having advanced as far as 56 degrees, and seeing that at this point the land turned towards the east, I despaired of finding any passage, and I was about to examine the coast in this direction towards the equinoctial line, always with the same object of finding a passage to the Indies, and in the end I reached the country now called Florida, where, as provisions were beginning to run short, I resolved to return to England. This narrative, of which we have given the commencement above, was related by Cabot to Fracastor, 40 or 50 years after the event. Also, is it not astonishing that Cabot mixes up in it 2 perfectly distinct voyages, that of 1494 and that of 1497? Let us add some reflections upon this narrative. The first land seen was, without doubt, the North Cape, the northern extremity of the island of Cape Breton, and the island which is opposite to it is that of Prince Edward, long known by the name of St. John's Island. Cabot probably penetrated into the estuary of the St. Lawrence, which he took for an arm of the sea, near to the place where Quebec now stands, and coasted along the northern shore of the Gulf, so that he did not see the coast of Labrador stretching away in the east. He took Newfoundland for an archipelago, and continued his course to the south, not, doubtless, as far as Florida as he states himself, the time occupied by the voyage making it impossible that he could have descended so low, but as far as the Chesapeake Bay. These were the countries which the Spaniards afterwards called Terra de Estevam Gomez. On the 3rd of February, 1498, King Henry VII. Signed at Westminster some new letters patent. He empowered John Cabot, or his representative, being duly authorized, to take in English ports 6 vessels of 200 tons burden, and to procure all that should be required for their equipment, at the same price as if they were for the crown. He was allowed to take on board such master mariners, pages, and other subjects as might of their own accord wish to go, and pass with him to the recently discovered lands and islands. John Cabot bore the expense of the equipment of 2 vessels, and 3 others were fitted out at the cost of the merchants of Bristol. In all probability it was death, a sudden and unexpected death, which prevented John Cabot from taking command of this expedition. His son Sebastian then assumed the direction of the fleet, which carried 300 men and provisions for a year. After having sighted land at 45 degrees, Sebastian Cabot followed the coast as far as 58 degrees, perhaps even higher, but then it became so cold, and although it was the month of July, there was so much floating ice about that it would have been impossible to go further northwards. The days were very long, and the nights excessively light, an interesting detail by which to fix the latitude reached, for we know that below the 60th parallel of latitude the longest days are 18 hours. These various reasons make Sebastian Cabot decide to put about, and he touched at the Moluccas Islands, of which the inhabitants, who were clothed in the skins of animals, were armed with bows and arrows, lance, javelin, and wooden sword. The navigators here caught a great number of codfish. They were even so numerous, says an old narrative, that they hindered ships from advancing. After having sailed along the coast of America as far as 38 degrees, Cabot set out for England, where he arrived at the beginning of autumn. This voyage had indeed a threefold object, that of discovery, commerce, and colonization, as is shown by the number of vessels which took part in it, and the strength of their crews. Nevertheless, it does not appear that Cabot landed any one, or that he made any attempts at forming a settlement, either in Labrador or in Hudson's Bay, which he was destined to explore more completely in 1517 in the reign of Henry VIII., or even to the south of the Moluccas, known by the general name of Newfoundland. At the close of this expedition, which was almost entirely unproductive, we lose sight of Sebastian Cabot, if not completely, at least so as to be insufficiently informed about his deeds and voyages until 1517. The traveller Hojeda, whose various enterprises we have related above, had left Spain in the month of May, 1499. We know that in this voyage he met with an Englishman at Cocobaco, on the coast of America. Can this have been Cabot? Nothing has come to light to enable us to settle this point, but we may believe that Cabot did not remain idle, and that he would be likely to undertake some fresh expedition. What we know is, that in spite of the solemn engagements he had made with Cabot, the King of England granted certain privileges of trading in the countries which he had discovered to the Portuguese and to the merchants of Bristol. This ungenerous manner of recognizing his services wounded the navigator, and decided him to accept the offers which had been made to him on different occasions to enter the Spanish service. From the death of Vespucius, which happened in 1512, Cabot was the navigator held in most renown. To attach him to himself, Ferdinand wrote on the 13th of September, 1512, to Lord Willoughby, commander-in-chief of the troops which had been transported to Italy, to treat with the Venetian navigator. As soon as he arrived in Castile, Cabot received the rank of captain, by an edict dated the 20th of October, 1512, with a salary of 5,000 maravedis. Seville was fixed upon for his residence, until an opportunity might arise of turning his talents in expedition to account. There was a plan on foot for his taking the command of a very important expedition, when Ferdinand, the Catholic, died on the 23rd of January, 1516. Cabot returned at once to England, probably having obtained a leave of absence. Eden tells us that the following year Cabot was appointed with Sir Thomas Pert to the command of a fleet which was to reach China by the northwest. On the 11th of June he was in Hudson's Bay at 67½ degrees of latitude. The sea free from ice spread itself out before him so far that he reckoned upon success for his enterprise, when the faint-heartedness of his companion, together with the cowardice and mutinous spirit of the crews, who refused to go any further, obliged him to return to England. In his Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, Ortelius traces the shape of Hudson's Bay as it really is. He even indicates at its northern extremity a strait leading northwards. How can the geographer have attained such exactness? Who, says Mr. Nicholls, can have given him the information set forth in his map, if not Cabot? On his return to England, Cabot found the country ravaged by a horrible plague, which put a stop even to commercial transactions. Soon, either because the time of his leave had expired, or that he wished to escape from the pestilence, or that he was recalled to Spain, the Venetian navigator returned to that country. In 1518, on the 5th of February, Cabot was made pilot major, with a salary which, added to that which he already had, made a total of 125,000 maravedis, say 300 ducats. He did not actually exercise the function of his office until Charles V returned from England. His principal duty consisted in examining pilots, who were not allowed to go to the Indies until after having passed this exam. This epoch was by no means favourable to great maritime expeditions. The struggle between France and Spain absorbed all the resources both in men and money of these two countries. Cabot, too, who seems to have adopted science for his fatherland much more than any particular country, made some overtures to Contarini, the ambassador of Venice, to take service on board the fleets of the Republic, but when the favorable answer of the Council of Ten arrived, he had other projects in his head, and did not carry his attempt any further. In the month of April, 1524, Cabot presided at a conference of mariners and cosmographers, which met at Badajoz, to discuss the question whether the Moluccas belonged, according to the celebrated treaty of Tordesillas, to Spain or Portugal. On the 31st of May, it was decided that the Moluccas were within the Spanish waters by 20 degrees. Perhaps this resolution of the Junta, of which Cabot was president, and which again placed in the hands of Spain a great part of the spice trade, was not without its influence upon the resolutions of the Council of the Indies. However this may be, in the month of September of the same year Cabot was authorized to take the command of 3 vessels of 100 tons and a small caravel, carrying together 150 men, with the title of Captain General. The declared aim of this voyage was to pass through the Straits of Magellan, carefully to explore the western coast of America, and to reach the Moluccas, where they would take in on their return a cargo of spices. The month of August, 1525, had been fixed upon as the date of departure, but the intrigues of Portugal succeeded in delaying it until April, 1526. Different circumstances seem from this moment to have augured ill for the voyage. Cabot had only a nominal authority, and the association of merchants who had defrayed the expenses of the equipment not accepting him willingly as chief, had found means to oppose all the plans of the Venetian sailor. Thus it was that in place of the man whom he had appointed as second in command, another was imposed upon him, and that instructions destined to be unsealed when at sea were delivered to each captain. They contained this absurd agreement, that in case of the death of the captain general, 11 individuals were to succeed him each in his turn. Was not this an encouragement given to assassination? Scarcely was the fleet out of sight of land, when discontent appeared. The rumour spread that the captain general was not equal to his task. Then, as they saw that these calumnies did not affect him, they pretended that the flotilla was already short of provisions. The mutiny broke out as soon as land was reached, but Cabot was not the man to allow himself to be annihilated by it. He had suffered too much from Sir Thomas's pert cowardice to bear such an insult. In order to nip the evil in the bud, he had the mutinous captains seized, and notwithstanding their reputation and the brilliancy of their past services, he made them get into a boat and abandoned them on shore. 4 months afterwards they had the good luck to be picked up by a Portuguese expedition, which seems to have had orders to thwart the plans of Cabot. The Venetian navigator then penetrated into the Rio de la Plata, the exploration of which had been commenced by his predecessor, the pilot Major de Solis. The expedition was not then composed of more than 2 vessels, one having been lost during the voyage. Cabot sailed up the Argent River, and discovered an island which he called Francis Gabriel, and upon which he built the fort of San Salvador, entrusting the command of it to Antonio de la Gaya. Cabot had the keel removed from one of his caravels, and with it, being towed by his small boats, entered the Parana, built a new fort at the confluence of the Carmacaraja and Terceiro, and, after having thus secured his line of retreat, he pursued the course of these rivers further into the interior. Arriving at the confluence of the Parana and the Paraguay, he followed the second, the direction of which agreed best with his project of reaching the region of the west where silver was to be obtained. But it was not long before the aspect of the country changed, and the attitude of the inhabitants altered also. Until now they had collected in crowds, astonished at the sight of the vessels, but upon the cultivated shores of the Paraguay they courageously opposed the strangers' landing, and 3 Spaniards having tried to knock down the fruit from a palm tree, a struggle took place, in which 300 natives lost their lives. This victory had disabled 25 Spaniards. It was too much for Cabot, who rapidly removed his wounded to the Fort San Spirito and retired, still presenting a bold front to the enemy. Cabot had already sent 2 of his companions to the Emperor, to acquaint him with the attempt at revolt of the captains, to explain to him the motives which had obliged him to modify the course marked out for his voyage, and to request aid for him, both in men and provisions. The answer arrived at last. The Emperor approved of what Cabot had done, and ordered him to colonize the country in which he had just made a settlement, but did not send him either one man or a single maravedi. Cabot tried to procure the resources which he needed in the country, and caused some attempts at cultivation to be commenced. At the same time, to keep his troops in exercise, he reduced the neighboring nations to obedience, had some forts built, and again sailing up the Paraguay, he reached Potosi, the watercourses of the Andes which feed the basin of the Atlantic. At last he prepared to enter Peru, from whence came the gold and silver which he had seen in the possession of the natives, but it needed more troops than he could muster to attempt the conquest of this vast region. The Emperor, however, was quite unable to send him any. His European wars absorbed all his resources. The Cortes refused to vote new subsidies, and the Moluccas had just been pledged to Portugal. In this state of affairs, After having occupied the country for 5 years, and waited all this time for the assistance which never came, Cabot decided to evacuate a part of his settlements, and he returned with some of his people to Spain. The rest, amounting to 120 men who were left to guard the fort of San Spirito, after many vicissitudes which cannot be related here, perished by the hands of the Indians, or were obliged to take refuge in the Portuguese settlements on the coast of Brazil. It is to the horses imported by Cabot that is due the wonderful race of wild horses which may be seen in large troops on the pampas of La Plata at the present day. This was the only result of the expedition. Some time after his return to Spain, Cabot resigned his office and went to Bristol, where he settled about 1548, that is to say, at the beginning of the reign of Edward VI. What were the motives of this fresh change? Was Cabot discontented at having been left to his own resources during the expedition? Was he hurt at the manner in which his services were recompensed? It is impossible to say. But Charles V. took advantage of Cabot's departure to deprive him of his pension, which Edward VI. Hastened to replace, causing him to receive 250 marks annually, about £116 and a fraction, which was a considerable sum for that period. The post which Cabot occupied in England seems to be best expressed by the name of Intendant of the Navy. Under the authority of the king and council, he appears to have superintended all maritime affairs. He issues licenses, he examines pilots, he frames instructions, he draws maps, a varied and complicated function for which he has possessed the rare gift of both practical and theoretical knowledge. At the same time, he instructed the young king in cosmography, explained to him the variation of the compass, and was successful in interesting him in nautical matters and in the glory resulting from maritime discoveries. It was a high and almost unique situation. Cabot used it to put into execution a project which he had long cherished. At this period, we might almost say that there was no trade in England. All commerce was in the hands of the Hanseatic towns, Antwerp, Hamburg, Brenham, etc. These companies of merchants had, on various occasions, obtained considerable reductions in import duties, and had ended by monopolizing the English trade. Cabot held that Englishmen possessed as good qualifications as these merchants for becoming manufacturers, and that the already powerful navy which England possessed might assist marvellously in the export of the products of the soil and of the manufactures. What was the use of having recourse to strangers when people could do their own business? If they had been unable up to this time to reach Cathay and India by the northwest, might they not endeavour to reach it by the northeast? And if they did not succeed, would they not find in this direction more commercial and more civilized people than the miserable Esquimaux on the coast of Labrador and Newfoundland? Cabot assembled some leading London merchants, laid his projects before them, and formed them into an association, of which on the 14th of December 1551 he was named president for life. At the same time he exerted himself most vigorously with the king, and after having made him understand the wrong which the monopoly enjoyed by strangers did to his own subjects, he obtained its abolition on the 23rd of February 1551, and inaugurated the practice of free trade. The association of English merchants, under the name of merchant adventurers, hastened to have some vessels built, adapted to the difficulties to be encountered in the navigation of the Arctic regions. The first improvement which the English marine owed to Cabot was the sheathing of the keels, which he had done in Spain, but which had not hitherto been practised in England. A flotilla of 3 vessels was assembled at Deptford. They were the Buena Speranza, of which the command was given to Sir Hugh Willoughby, a brave gentleman who had earned a high reputation in war; the Buena Confidencia, Captain Cornwall Dornforth; and the Bonaventure, Captain Richard Chancellor, a clever sailor, and a particular friend of Cabot's. He received the title of pilot major. The sailing master of the Bonaventure was Stephen Burrough, an accomplished mariner, who was destined to make numerous voyages in the North Seas, and later to become pilot in chief for England. Although age and its important duties prevented Cabot from placing himself at the head of the expedition, he wished at least to preside over all the details of the equipment. He himself wrote out the instructions which have been preserved, and which prove the prudence and skill of this distinguished navigator. He there recommends the use of the log line, an instrument intended to measure the speed of the vessel, and he desires that the journal of events happening at sea be kept with regularity, and that all information as to the character, manners, habits, and resources of the people visited, and the productions of the country, may be recorded in writing. The sailors were to offer no violence to the natives, but to act towards them with courtesy. All blasphemy and swearing was to be punished with severity, and also drunkenness. The religious exercises are prescribed, prayers are to be said morning and evening, and the Holy Scriptures are to be read once in the day. Cabot ends by recommending union and concord above all, and reminds the captains of the greatness of their enterprise, and the honour which they might hope to gain. Finally, he promises them to add his prayers to theirs for the success of their common work. The squadron set sail on the 20th of May, 1558, in presence of the court assembled at Greenwich, amid an immense concourse of people, after fêtes and rejoicing, at which the king, who was ill, could not be present. Near the Lufton Islands, on the coast of Norway, at the bearing of Wodros, the squadron was separated from the Bonaventure. Carried away by the storm, Willoughby's two vessels touched, without doubt, at Nova Zembla, and were forced by the ice to return southward. On the 18th of September they entered the port formed by the mouth of the river Arnza in East Lapland. Some time afterwards the Buena Confidencia, separated from Willoughby by a fresh tempest, returned to England. As to the latter, some Russian fishermen found his vessel the following year in the midst of the ice. The whole crew had died of cold. This, at least, is what we are led to suppose from the journal kept by the unfortunate Willoughby up to the month of January 1554. Chancellor, after having waited in vain for his two consorts at the rendezvous which had been agreed upon in case of separation, thought they must have outsailed him, and rounding the North Cape, he entered a vast gulf which was none other than the White Sea. He then landed at the mouth of Duenna, near the monastery of St. Nicholas, on the spot upon which the town of Archangel was soon to stand. The inhabitants of these desolate places told him that the country was under the dominion of the Grand Duke of Russia. Chancellor resolved at once to go to Moscow, in spite of the enormous distance which separated him from it. The Czar then on the throne was Ivan IV. Vasilyevich, called the Terrible. For some time before this the Russians had shaken off the Tartar yoke, and Ivan had united all the petty rival principalities in one body politic, of which the power was already becoming considerable. The situation of Russia, exclusively continental, far from any frequented sea, isolated from the rest of Europe, of which it did not yet form part, so much were its habits and manners still Asiatic, promised success to Chancellor. The Czar, who up to this time had not been able to procure European merchandise, except by way of Poland, and who wished to gain access to the German seas, saw with pleasure the attempts of the English to establish trade which would be beneficial to both parties. He not only received Chancellor courteously, but he made him most advantageous offers, granted him great privileges, and encouraged him, by the kindness of his reception, to repeat his voyage. Chancellor sold his merchandise to great advantage, and after taking on board another cargo of furs, of seal and whale oils, copper, and other products, returned to England, carrying a letter from the Czar. The advantages which the company of merchant adventurers had derived from this first voyage encouraged them to attempt a second. So Chancellor, the following year, made a fresh voyage to Archangel, and took two of the company's agents to Russia, who concluded an advantageous treaty with the Czar. Then he set out again for England, with an ambassador and his suite, sent by Ivan to Great Britain. Of the 4 vessels which composed the flotilla, one was lost on the coast of Norway, another as it left Drontheim, and the Bonaventure, on board which were Chancellor and the ambassador, foundered in the Bay of Pitsligo, on the east coast of Scotland, on the 10th of November 1556. Chancellor was drowned in the wreck, being less fortunate than the Muscovite ambassador, who had the good luck to escape, but the presents and merchandise which he was carrying to England were lost. Such was the commencement of the Anglo-Russian Company. A goodly number of expeditions succeeded each other in those parts, but it would be beside our purposes to give an account of them. Let us now return to Cabot. It was in 1554 that Queen Mary of England was married to Philip II., King of Spain. When the latter came to England, he showed himself very ill disposed towards Cabot, who had abandoned the service of Spain, and who, at this very moment was procuring for England a commerce which would soon immensely increase the maritime power of an already formidable country. Thus we are not surprised to learn that 8 days after the landing of the King of Spain, Cabot was forced to resign his office and his pension, both of which had been bestowed upon him for life by Edward VI. Worthington was nominated in his place. Mr. Nichols thinks that this dishonourable man, who had some quarrels with the law, had a secret mission to seize among Cabot's plans, maps, instructions, and projects those which could be of use to Spain. The fact is that all these documents are now lost, at least unless they may yet be discovered among the archives of Simancas. At the end of this period history completely loses sight of the old mariner. The same mystery which hangs over his birth also envelopes the place and date of his death. His immense discoveries, his cosmographical works, his study of the variations of the magnetic needle, his wisdom, his humane disposition, and his honourable conduct, place Sebastian Cabot in the foremost rank among discoverers. A figure lost in the shadow and vagueness of legend until our own day, Cabot owes it to his biographers, to Biddle, de Ranzac, and Nichols, that he is now better known, more highly appreciated, and for the first time really placed in the light. End of the second part. Chapter 3, Part 1, B. Recording by Todd.
Section 36 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stephen Reynolds. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. Exploration of the World by Jules Verne. Second part, Chapter 3, Part 2a. Polar Expeditions. From 1492 to 1524, France had stood aloof, officially at least, from enterprises of discovery and colonization. But Francis I could not look on quietly while the power of his rival Charles V received a large addition by the conquest of Mexico. He therefore ordered John Verrazzano, a Venetian who was in his service, to make a voyage of exploration. We will pause here for a short time, although the various places may have already been visited on several occasions, because for the first time the banner of France floats over the shores of the New World. This exploration, besides, was to prepare the way for those of Jacques Cartier and of Champlain in Canada, as well as for the unlucky experiments in colonization of Jean Ribaut and of Laudonnière, the sanguinary voyages of reprisals of Gourgues, and Villegagnon's attempt at a settlement in Brazil. We possess no biographical details with regard to Verrazzano. Under what circumstances did he enter the service of France? Was his title to the command of such an expedition? Nothing is known of the Venetian traveller, for all we possess of his writings is the Italian translation of his French report to Francis I, published in the collection of Ramusio. The French translation of this Italian translation exists in an abridged form in Lescarbot's work on New France, and in the Histoire des Voyages. For our very rapid epitome, we shall make use of the Italian text of Ramusio, except in some passages where Lescarbot's translation has appeared to give an idea of the rich, original, and marvellously modulated language of the 16th century. Having set out with 4 vessels to make discoveries in the ocean, says Verrazzano in a letter written from Dieppe to Francis I on 8th July 1524, he was forced by a storm to take refuge in Brittany, with 2 of his vessels, the Dauphine and the Normande, there to repair damages. Thence he set sail for the coast of Spain, where he seems to have given chase to some Spanish vessels. We see him leave the Dauphine alone on the 17th of January 1524, a small uninhabited island in the neighbourhood of Madeira, and launch himself upon the ocean with a crew of 50 men, well furnished with provisions and ammunition for an 8 months' voyage. 25 days later he has made 1,500 miles to the west, when he is assailed by a fearful storm, and 25 days afterwards, that is to say on the 8th or 9th of March, having made about 1,200 miles, he discovers land at 30 degrees north latitude, which he thought had never been previously explored. When we arrived, it seemed to us to be very low, but on approaching within a quarter of a league, we saw by the great fires which were lighted among the harbours and borders of the sea, that it was inhabited, and in taking trouble to find a harbour in which to land and make acquaintance with the country, we sailed more than 150 miles in vain, so that seeing the coast trended ever southwards, we decided to turn back again. The Frenchmen, finding a favourable landing place, perceived a number of natives who came towards them, but who fled away when they saw them land. Soon recalled by the friendly signs and demonstrations of the French, they showed a great surprise at their clothes, their faces, and the whiteness of their skin. The natives were entirely naked, except that the middle of the body was covered with sable skins, hung from a narrow girdle of prettily woven grasses, and ornamented with tails of other animals, which fell to their knees. Some wore crowns of birds' feathers. "They have brown skins," says the narrative, "and are exactly like the Saracens. Their hair is black, not very long, and tied at the back of the head, in the form of a small tail. Their limbs are well proportioned. They are of middle height, although a little taller than ourselves, and have no other defect beyond their faces being rather broad. They are not strong, but they are agile, and some of the greatest and quickest runners in the world. It was impossible for Verrazzano to collect any details about the manners and mode of life of these people, on account of the short time that he remained among them. The shore at this place was composed of fine sand, interspersed here and there with little sandy hillocks, behind which were scattered groves and very thick forests, which were wonderfully pleasant to look upon. There were in this country, as far as we could judge, abundance of stags, fallow deer, and hares, numerous lakes and streams of sparkling water, as well as a quantity of birds. This land lies at 34 degrees. It is therefore the part of the United States which now goes by the name of Carolina. The air there is pure and salubrious, the climate temperate, the sea is entirely without rocks, and in spite of the want of harbours, it is not unfavourable for navigators. During the whole month of March, the French sailed along the coast, which seemed to them to be inhabited by a numerous population. The want of water forced them to land several times, and they perceived that the savages were most pleased with mirrors, bells, knives, and sheets of paper. One day they sent a longboat ashore with 25 men in it. A young sailor jumped into the water, because he could not land on account of the waves and currents, in order to give some small articles to these people, and having thrown to them from a distance because he was distrustful of the natives, he was cast violently on shore by the waves. The Indians, seeing him in this condition, take him and carry him far away from the sea, to the great dismay of the poor sailor, who expected they were about to sacrifice him. Having placed him at the foot of a little hill, in the full blaze of the sun, they stripped him quite naked, and wondered at the whiteness of his skin. Then, lighting a large fire, they made him come to it, and recover his strength. And it was then that the poor young man, as well as those who were in the boat, thought that the Indians were about to massacre and immolate him, roasting his flesh in this large brazier, and then eating their victim, as do the cannibals. But it happened quite differently, for having shown a desire to return to the boat, they reconducted him to the edge of the sea, and having kissed him very lovingly, they retired to a hill to see him re-enter the boat. Continuing to follow the shore northwards for more than 150 miles, the Frenchmen reached a land which seemed to them more beautiful, being covered with thick woods. Into these forests 20 men penetrated for more than 6 miles, and only returned to the shore from the fear of losing themselves. In this walk, having met 2 women, one young and the other old, with some children, they seized one of the latter, who might be about 8 years old, with the idea of taking him away to France, but they could not do the same with the young woman, who began to cry with all her might, calling for aid from her compatriots who were hidden in the wood. In this place the savages were whiter than any of those hitherto met. They snared birds and used a bow of very hard wood, and arrows tipped with fish bones. Their canoes 20 feet long and 4 feet wide were hollowed by fire out of the trunk of a tree. Wild vines abounded and climbed over the trees in long festoons, as they do in Lombardy. With a little civilization they would no doubt produce excellent wine. For the fruit is sweet and pleasant like ours, and we thought that the natives were not insensible to it, for in all directions where these vines grew, they had taken care to cut away the branches of the surrounding trees, so that the fruit might ripen. Wild roses, lilies, violets, and all kinds of odoriferous plants and flowers new to the Europeans, carpeted the ground everywhere, and filled the air with sweet perfumes. After remaining for 3 days in this enchanting place, the Frenchmen continued to follow the coast northwards, sailing by day and casting anchor at night. As the land trended towards the east, they went 150 miles further in that direction, and discovered an island of triangular shape, about 30 miles distant from the continent, similar in size to the island of Rhodes, and upon which they bestowed the name of the mother of Francis I., Louisa of Savoy. Then they reached another island 45 miles off, which possessed a magnificent harbour, and of which the inhabitants came in crowds to visit the strange vessels. Two kings especially were of fine stature and great beauty. They were dressed in deerskins, with the head bare, the hair carried back and tied in a tuft, and they wore on the neck a large chain ornamented with coloured stones. This was the most remarkable nation which they had until now met with. "The women are graceful," says the narrative published by Ramusio. "Some wore the skins of the lynx on their arms. Their head was ornamented with their plaited hair, and long plaits hung down on both sides of the chest. Others had headdresses which recalled those of the Egyptian and Syrian women. Only the elderly women, and those who were married, wore pendants in their ears of worked copper. This land is situated on the same parallel as Rome, in 41 degrees 40 minutes, but its climate is much colder." On the 5th of May, Verrazzano left this port and sailed along the sea shore for 450 miles. At last he reached a country of which the inhabitants resembled but little any of those whom he had hitherto met with. They were so wild that it was impossible to carry on any trade with them, or any sustained intercourse. What they had appeared to esteem above everything else were fish hooks, knives, and all articles of metal, attaching no value to all the trifling baubles which up to this time had served for barter. 25 armed men landed and advanced from 4 to 6 miles into the interior of the country. They were received by the natives with flights of arrows, after which the latter retired into the immense forests which appeared to cover the whole country. 150 miles further on spreads out a vast archipelago, composed of 32 islands, all near the land, separated by narrow canals, which reminded the Venetian navigator of the archipelagos which in the Adriatic border the coasts of Sclavonia and Dalmatia. At length, 450 miles further on, in latitude 50 degrees, the French came to lands which had been previously discovered by the Bretons. Finding themselves then short of provisions, and having reconnoitred the coast of America for a distance of 2,100 miles, they returned to France, and disembarked safely at Dieppe in the month of July, 1524. Some historians relate that Verrazzano was made prisoner by the savages who inhabit the coast of Labrador, and was eaten by them. A fact which is simply impossible, since he addressed from Dieppe to Francis I. the account of his voyage which we have just abridged. Besides, the Indians of these regions were not anthropophagi. Certain authors, but we have not been able to discover on the authority of what documents, nor under what circumstances this happened, relate that Verrazzano, having fallen into the power of the Spaniards, had been taken to Spain, and there hanged. It is much wiser to admit that we know nothing certain about Verrazzano, and that we are totally ignorant what rewards his long voyage procured for him. Perhaps when some learned man shall have looked through our archives, of which the abstract and inventory are far from being finished, he may recover some new documents, but for the present we must confine ourselves to the narrative of Ramusio. 10 years later, a captain of Saint-Malo, named Jacques Cartier, born on the 21st of December, 1484, conceived the project of establishing a colony in the northern part of America. Being favourably received by Admiral Philippe de Chabot and by Francis I., who asked to see the clause in Adams's will which disinherited him of the New World in favour of the kings of Spain and Portugal, Cartier left St. Malo with 2 vessels on the 20th of April, 1534. The vessel which carried him weighed only 60 tons, and carried a crew of 61 men. At the end of only 20 days, so favourable was the voyage, Cartier discovered Newfoundland at Cape Bonavista. He then went northwards as far as Bird Island, which he found surrounded by ice, all broken up and melting, but on which he was able nevertheless to lay in a stock of 5 or 6 tons of guillemots, puffins, and penguins, without reckoning those which were eaten fresh. He then explored all the coast of the island, which at this time bore a number of Breton names, thus proving the assiduous manner in which the French frequented these shores. Then penetrating into the Strait of Belle Isle, which separates the continent from the island of Newfoundland, Cartier arrived at the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Along the whole of this coast the harbours are excellent. "If the land only corresponded to the goodness of the harbours," says the St. Malo sailor, "it would be a great blessing, but one ought not call it Itland. It is rather pebbles and savage rocks, and places fit for wild beasts. As for all the land towards the north, I never saw as much earth there as would fill a tumbrel." After having coasted along the continent, Cartier was cast by a tempest upon the west coast of Newfoundland, where he explored Cape Royal and Cape Milk, the Columba Islands, Cape St. Jean, the Magdalen Islands, and the Bay of Miramichi, on the continent. In this place he had some intercourse with the savages, who showed a great and marvellous eagerness in the acquisition of iron tools and other things, always dancing and performing various ceremonies, among others throwing sea water on their heads with their hands. So well did they receive us that they gave us all that they had, keeping back nothing. The next day the number of the savages was even greater, and our French sailors made an ample harvest of furs and skins of animals. After having explored the Bay of Chaleur, Cartier arrived at the entrance of the estuary of the St. Lawrence, where he saw some natives who possessed neither the appearance nor the language of the first. The latter may truly be called savages, for no poorer people can be found in the world, and I think that all put together, excepting their boats and their nets, they could not have had the value of 2d. halfpenny. They have the head entirely shaved, with the exception of a lock of hair on the very top, which they allow to grow as long as a horse's tail, and which they fasten upon the head with some small copper needles. Their only dwelling is underneath their boats, which they overturn and then stretch themselves on the ground beneath them without any covering. After having planted a large cross in this place, Jacques Cartier obtained the chief's permission to take away with him 2 of his children, whom he was to bring back again on his next voyage. Then he set out again for France, and landed at St. Malo on the 5th of September, 1534. The following year, on the 19th of May, Cartier left St. Malo at the head of a fleet composed of 3 vessels, called the Grand, and the Petite Hermine, and the Emerillon, on board of which some gentlemen of high rank had taken passages, among whom may be named Charles de la Pommeraye, and Claude de Pontbriand, son of the Sieur de Montcavel, and cupbearer to the Dauphin. Very soon the squadron was dispersed by the storm, and could not be brought together again until it reached Newfoundland. After having landed at Bird Island in Whitesand Harbour, which is the Castle Bay, Cartier penetrated into the Bay of St. Lawrence. He discovered there the island of Natiscotec, which we call Anticosti, and entered a great river called Hochelaga, which leads to Canada. On the banks of this river lies the country called Saguenay, whence comes the red copper, to which the 2 savages whom he had taken on his first voyage gave the name of Caquet d'Azay. But before entering the St. Lawrence, Cartier wished to explore the whole gulf, to see if no passage existed to the north. He afterwards returned to the Bay of the 7 Islands, went up the river, and soon reached the river of Saguenay, which falls into the St. Lawrence on its northern bank. A little further on, after passing by 14 islands, he entered the Canadian territories, which no traveller before him had ever visited. The next day the Lord of Canada, called Donnacona, with 12 boats and accompanied by 16 men, approached the ships. When abreast of the smallest of our vessels, he began to make a palaver or preachment in their fashion, while moving his body and limbs in a marvellous manner, which is a sign of joy and confidence. And when he arrived at the flagship, where there were 2 Indians who had been brought back from France, the said chief spoke to them, and they to him. And they began to relate to him what they had seen in France, and the good treatment which they had received, at which the said chief was very joyful, and begged the captain to give him his arms that he might kiss and embrace him, which is their mode of welcome in this country. The country of Stadaconé, or St. Charles, is fertile and full of very fine trees of the same nature and kind as in France, such as oaks, elms, plum trees, yews, cedars, vines, hawthorns, which bear fruit as large as damsons, and other trees. Beneath them grows hemp as good as that of France. Cartier succeeded afterwards in reaching with his boats and his galleon a place which is the Richelieu of the present day, next a great lake formed by the river St. Peter's Lake, and at last he arrived at Hochelaga, or Montreal, which is 630 miles from the mouth of the St. Lawrence. In this place are ploughed lands and large and beautiful plains full of the corn of the country, which is like the millet of Brazil, as large or larger than peas, on which they live as we do on wheat. And among these plains is placed and seated the said town of Hochelaga, near to and joining on to some high ground which is around the town, and which is well cultivated and quite small. From the top of it one can see very far. We named this mountain Mount Royal. The welcome given to Jacques Cartier could not have been more cordial. The chief, or Agouhanna, who was crippled in all his limbs, begged the captain to touch them as if he had asked him for a cure. Then the blind and those who were blind in one eye, the lame and the impotent came and sat down near Jacques Cartier, that he might touch them, so thoroughly were they persuaded that he was a god descended to heal them. The said captain, seeing the faith and piety of this people, recited the Gospel of St. John, namely, in principio, making the sign of the cross over the poor sick people, praying God that he would give them the knowledge of our holy faith, and grace to accept Christianity and baptism. Then the said captain took a book of Hours and read aloud the Passion of our Saviour, so well that all those present could hear it, all the poor people being quite silent, looking up to heaven and using the same ceremonies as they saw us use. After making themselves acquainted with the country, which could be seen for 90 miles around from the top of Mount Royal, and having collected some information about the waterfalls and rapids of the St. Lawrence, Jacques Cartier returned towards Canada, where he did not delay to rejoin his ships. We owe to him the first information on tobacco for smoking, which does not seem to have been in use throughout the whole extent of the New World. They have a herb, he says, of which they collect great quantities during the summer for the winter. They esteem it highly, and the men alone use it in the following manner. They dry it in the sun, and carry it on their necks in a small skin of an animal in the shape of a bag, with a horn of stone or of wood. Then constantly they make the said herb into a powder, and put it into one of the ends of the said horn. They then place a live coal upon it and blow through the other end, and so fill their body with smoke that it issues from the mouth and nostrils, as if from the shaft of a chimney. We have tried said smoke, but after having put it into our mouths, it seemed as if there were a ground pepper in them, so hot is it. In the month of December, the inhabitants of Stadaconé were attacked by an infectious disease which proved to be the scurvy. This malady spread so rapidly in our vessels that by the middle of February, out of our 110 men, there were but 10 in good health. Neither prayers, nor orison, nor vows to Our Lady of Rocamadour brought any relief. 25 Frenchmen perished up to the 18th of April, and there were not 4 amongst them who were not attacked by the malady. But at this time a savage chief informed Jacques Cartier that a decoction of the leaves and the sap of a certain tree, probably either the Canadian fir tree or the barberry, was very salutary. As soon as 2 or 3 had experienced its beneficial effects, there was a crowding as if they would have killed each other to be the first to get the medicine. And one of the tallest and largest trees I ever saw was used in less than 8 days, which had such an effect that if all the doctors of Louvain and Montpellier had been there with all the drugs of Alexandria, they had not done as much in a year as the said tree accomplished in 80 days. Some time after, Cartier, having noticed that Donnacona were trying to excite sedition against the French, caused him to be seized as well as 9 other savages, that he might take them to France, where they died. He set sail from the harbour of St. Croix on the 6th of May, descended the St. Lawrence, and after a voyage which was not marked by any incident, he landed at St. Malo on the 16th of July, 1536. Francis I, in consequence of the report of this voyage, which the St. Malo captain made to him, resolved to take effective possession of the country. After having appointed François de la Roque, Sieur de Roberval, Viceroy of Canada, he caused 5 vessels to be fitted out, which being laden with provisions and ammunition for 2 years, were to transport Roberval and a certain number of soldiers, artisans, and gentlemen to the new colony, which they were about to establish. The 5 vessels set sail on the 23rd of May, 1541. They met with such contrary winds that it took them 3 months to reach Newfoundland. Cartier did not arrive at the harbour of St. Croix until the 23rd of August. As soon as he had landed his provisions, he sent back 2 of his vessels to France, with letters for the king telling him what had been done, also that the Sieur de Roberval had not yet appeared, and that they did not know what had happened to him. Then he had works commenced to clear the land, to build a fort, and to lay the first foundations of the town of Quebec. He next set out for Hochelaga, taking with him Martin de Paimpont and other gentlemen, and went to examine the 3 waterfalls of Sainte Marie, Le Chine, and Saint Louis. On his return to St. Croix, he found Roberval had just arrived. Cartier returned to St. Malo in the month of October, 1542, where probably 10 years later he died. As to the new colony, Roberval having perished in a second voyage, it vegetated, and was nothing more than a factory until 1608, the date of the foundation of Quebec by M. de Champlain, of whom we shall relate the services and discoveries a little further on. We have just seen how Cartier, who had set out first to seek for the Northwest Passage, had been led to take possession of the country and to lay the foundations of the colony of Canada. In England, a similar movement had begun, set on foot by the writings of Sir Humphrey Gilbert and of Richard Wills. They ended by carrying public opinion with them, and demonstrating that it was not more difficult to find this passage than it had been to discover the Strait of Magellan. One of the most ardent partisans of this search was a bold sailor called Martin Frobisher, who, after having many times applied to rich shipowners, at last found in Ambrose Dudley, Earl of Warwick, the favourite of Queen Elizabeth, a patron whose pecuniary help enabled him to build a pinnace and 2 poor barks, of from 20 to 25 tons burden. It was with means thus feeble that the intrepid navigator went to encounter the ice in localities which had never been visited since the time of Northmen. Setting out from Deptford on the 8th of June, 1576, he sighted the south of Greenland, which he took to be the Frisland of Zeno. Soon stopped by the ice, he was obliged to return to Labrador without being able to land there, and he entered Hudson's Straits. After having coasted along Savage and Resolution Islands, he entered a strait which has received his name, but which is also called by some geographers Lunley's Inlet. He landed at Cumberland, took possession of the country in the name of Queen Elizabeth, and entered into some relations with the natives. The cold increased rapidly, and he was obliged to return to England. Frobisher only brought back some rather vague scientific and geographical details about the countries which he had visited. He received, however, a most flattering welcome when he showed a heavy black stone in which a little gold was found. At once all imaginations were on fire. Several lords and the Queen herself contributed to the expense of a new armament, consisting of a vessel of 200 tons, with a crew of 100 men, and 2 smaller barks, which carried 6 months' provisions both for war and for nourishment. Frobisher had some experienced sailors, Fenson, York, George Best, and C. Hall, under his command. On the 31st of May, 1577, the expedition set sail, and soon sighted Greenland, of which the mountains were covered with snow, and the shores defended by a rampart of ice. The weather was bad. Exceedingly dense fogs, as thick as pea soup, said the English sailors, islands of ice 1.5 miles in circumference, floating mountains which were sunk 70 or 80 fathoms in the sea. Such were the obstacles which prevented Frobisher from reaching, before the 9th of August, the strait which he had discovered during his previous campaign. The English took possession of the country, and pursued both upon land and sea some poor Esquimaux, who, wounded in this encounter, jumped in despair from the top of the rocks into the sea, says Forster in his Voyages in the North, which would not have happened if they had shown themselves more submissive, or if we could have made them understand that we were not their enemies. A great quantity of stones, similar to that which had been brought to England, were soon discovered. They were of gold marcasite, and 200 tons of this substance was soon collected. In their delight, the English sailors set up a memorial column on a peak to which they gave the name of Warwick Mount, and performed solemn acts of thanksgiving. Frobisher afterwards went 90 miles further on in the same strait, as far as a small island, which received the name of Smith's Island. There the English found 2 women, of whom they took one with her child, but left the other on account of her extreme ugliness. Suspecting, so much did superstition and ignorance flourish at this time, that this woman had cloven feet, they made her take the coverings off her feet, to satisfy themselves that they really were made like their own. Frobisher, now perceiving that the cold was increasing, and wishing to place the treasures which he thought he had collected in a place of safety, resolved to give up for the present any farther search for the North-West Passage. He then set sail for England, where he arrived at the end of September, after weathering a storm which dispersed his fleet. The man, woman, and child who had been carried off were presented to the Queen. It is said with regard to them, that the man, seeing at Bristol Frobisher's trumpeter on horseback, wished to imitate him, and mounted with his face turned towards the tail of the animal. These savages were the objects of much curiosity, and obtained permission from the Queen to shoot all kinds of birds, even swans, on the Thames, a thing which was forbidden to everyone else under the most severe penalties. They did not long survive, and died before the child was 15 months old. People were not slow in discovering that the stones brought back by Frobisher really contained gold. The nation, but above all the higher classes, were immediately seized with a fever bordering on delirium. They had found a Peru, an El Dorado. Queen Elizabeth, in spite of her practical good sense, yielded to the current. She resolved to build a fort in the newly discovered country, to which she gave the name of Meta Incognita, unknown boundary, and to leave there with 100 men as garrison, under the command of Captains Fenton, Best, and Philpot, 3 vessels, which should take in a cargo of the auriferous stones. These 100 men were carefully chosen. There were bakers, carpenters, masons, gold refiners, and others belonging to all the various handicrafts. The fleet was composed of 15 vessels, which set sail from Harwich on the 31st of May, 1578. 20 days later the western coast of Frisland were discovered. Whales played around the vessels in innumerable troops. It is related even that one of the vessels, propelled by a favourable wind, struck against a whale with such force that the violence of the shock stopped the ship at once, and that the whale, after uttering a loud cry, made a spring out of the water, and then was suddenly swallowed up. 2 days later the fleet met with a dead whale, which they thought must be the one struck by the Salamander. When Frobisher came to the entrance of the strait, which has received his name, he found it blocked up with floating ice. The bark Dennis, 100 tons, says the old account of George Best, received such a shock from an iceberg that she sank in sight of the whole fleet. Following upon this catastrophe, a sudden and horrible tempest arose from the southeast. The vessels were surrounded on all sides by the ice. They left much of it, between which they could pass, behind them, and found still more before them, through which it was impossible for them to penetrate. Certain ships, either having found a place less blocked with ice, or one where it was possible to proceed, furled sails and drifted. Of the others, several stopped and cast their anchors upon a great island of ice. The latter were so rapidly enclosed by an infinite number of islets of ice and fragments of icebergs, that the English were obliged to resign themselves and their ships to the mercy of the ice, and to protect the ships with cables, cushions, mats, boards, and all kinds of articles which were suspended to the sides, in order to defend them from the fearful shocks and blows of the ice. Frobisher himself was thrown out of his course. Finding the impossibility of rallying his squadron, he sailed along the west coast of Greenland, as far as the strait which was soon to be called Davis's Strait, and penetrated as far as the Countess of Warwick Bay. When he had repaired his vessels with the wood which was to have been used in the building of a dwelling, he loaded the ships with 500 tons of stones, similar to those which had already been brought home. Judging the season to be then too far advanced, and considering also that the provisions had been either consumed or lost in the Dennis, that the wood for building had been used for repairing the vessels, and having lost 40 men, he set out on his return to England on the 31st of August. Tempests and storms accompanied him to the shores of his own country. As to the results of his expedition, there were almost none as to discoveries, and the stones, which he had put on board in the midst of so many dangers, were valueless. This was the last Arctic voyage in which Frobisher took part. In 1585 we meet with him again as vice-admiral under Drake. In 1588 he distinguished himself against the Invincible Armada. In 1590 he was with Sir Walter Raleigh's fleet on the coast of Spain. Finally, in a descent on the coast of France, he was so seriously wounded that he had only time to bring back his squadron to Portsmouth before he died. If Frobisher's voyages had only gain for their motive, we must put this down not to the navigator himself, but to the passions of the period. And it is not the less true that in difficult circumstances, and with means the insufficiency of which make us smile, he gave proof of courage, talent, and perseverance. To Frobisher is due, in one word, the glory of having shown the route to his countrymen, and of having made the first discoveries in the localities where the English name was destined to render itself illustrious. End of second part, Chapter 3, Part 2a. Recording by Stephen Reynolds, Durham, Connecticut.